Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Xinhu Yu. I'm the chair of RMIT Professorial Academy and also the host of this event. Firstly, I would like to make an acknowledgement. The next slide, please. So RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Wurrung and the Wurrung language group of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectively acknowledges their ancestors and elders, past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, where we conduct our business. Okay, so today we shall hear from distinguished Professor Helen Lingard, who is going to deliver a distinguished lecture on managing workers' health and safety in construction industry. So this is a part of the activities of the Professorial Academy to fulfill its obligation as ambassador, advocate, and thought leader for RMIT. So before we start, let's just go through some housekeeping matters. This is a team live event. You will not be able to directly ask any questions via microphone. However, you will be able to post your questions during the lecture in the conversation on the Q&A section. At the end of the lecture, I will pick up those popular questions to ask presenters on your behalf. Okay, let's get to the lecture start. First, I would like to introduce our speaker, distinguished Professor Helen Lingard, who has started her career working for contracting organization in the civil engineering construction sector in Hong Kong. Since moving to Australia, Helen has worked extensively as a consultant to organizations in the mining, construction, and telecommunication industries. She's currently working with government, industry leaders in the development of industry standards to improve worker hours, gender diversity, and health in the construction industry. So without any delay, please join me to welcome Helen to deliver her lecture. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Jing. It's my pleasure to be here speaking to you today. The title of today's talk is Managing Work Health and Safety in Complex Supply Networks, particularly looking at the construction industry experience. And this is important because the construction industry has some particular characteristics that can impact work health and safety that make it a little bit different from other industry contexts. And therefore, there's a need to understand these characteristics in order to make sure that more integrated and effective health and safety management processes are implemented across this complex supply network. So I'd like to acknowledge that this work isn't all done by me, and that I have a wonderful team of researchers who work for me and with me. And this team of researchers includes these people you see before you. They're the team as of 2021. But I'd also like to acknowledge that some of the research I'm going to talk about today is work that is involved lots of other different people along the way. So I want to acknowledge that this is a team effort, and our research is always conducted in teams. The Australian construction industry is economically and socially very significant. It generates over $360 billion in revenue each year and produces 9% of Australia's gross domestic product. It employs 1.2 million people, and currently we're seeing an unprecedented boom in infrastructure construction. The construction industry supply network is complex. It includes manufacturing of materials, equipment and components, services including engineering, design, surveying, consulting and lease management, and then traditional construction trades. And the ability to deliver the pipeline of projects that I just mentioned before is dependent on the industry being able to attract new workers and sustain a healthy and productive workforce, which makes work health and safety really important strategically to the industry. Now, the industry's health and safety performance is relatively poor compared to other sectors. The construction industry accounts for 9% of the workforce, but 12% of work-related fatalities, and about 12,600 workers' compensation claims are accepted from the industry each year, which equates to 35 serious claims every day. More concerningly, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics work-related injury survey data, the construction industry has 4 times the all industry's percentage of workers who have not returned to work following their injuries. So the construction industry percentage is 12% compared with 3% for all other industries, which is concerning because that means potentially up to 1,512 injured construction workers each year may not return to work. A more insidious problem, or an insidious problem experienced by the industry, is the state of mental health within the industry. And it's alarming to read the statistics relating to suicide among construction workers. So the Australian construction workforce is, if you're an Australian construction worker, you're 6 times more likely to die by suicide than as the result of a work-related accident. And construction apprentices are particularly vulnerable. They're 2.5 times more likely to suicide compared to other young men their age. So, you know, we have a serious problem in the industry that is different from the safety problem around workers' mental health, and particularly the high rate of suicide. Now, the industry characteristics are worth commenting on here. The industry is one of the worst performing industries for gender equality. So women make up only 11% of the entire construction workforce and only 1% of construction trades-based workers. And work is often physically and psychologically demanding. Hours in the construction industry, particularly in project-based work, are very long. And workers suffer high rates of musculoskeletal injury, particularly manual and non-managerial workers. And you can get a sense of what working in the construction industry can be like looking at this picture on the right, which shows a man doing some shotcreting. Now, shotcreting is basically holding a hose through which pressurized concrete is being pumped, and he's supporting it over his right shoulder. Now that puts a lot of strain on his body physically, but the hose, as he has to drag it to move along during this process, actually increases that physical load and that physical burden. And when we looked at this particular task as part of a study that we did, which I'll talk about in more detail later on, we looked at this father and son team who were doing this work, and importantly, the son expected to experience bodily pain like his father felt in his working life, and there was a sort of an acceptance that was just part and parcel of doing this job. So the question is, I guess, is the opportunity to improve, and is the industry really optimizing those opportunities to improve and seizing those opportunities? So here's an example of an alternative method of doing that shotcreting activity, which involves a mechanized approach, and the operator stands and uses a mechanized method of applying that shotcrete. This is used in other industries such as mining, and my question is, is this something that the construction industry should be challenging a little bit more in terms of some of the more traditional ways of working? So to the supply network and its characteristics, construction is delivered in projects. And projects by their nature are temporary management organisations. So a lot of different groups and people and contributors will come together across the life cycle of a project and work together just for the duration of that project. And then they'll disassemble at the end of the project and move on to the next project. So people working in these projects are also embedded both in their own parent organisations, and they're also involved in the project-based work. The organisations in the supply network are connected to one another in many different ways, and importantly, organisations can actually be collaborators in one context and competitors in the other. So you can see how the supply network complexities can play out. The commercial relationships in the delivery of projects are often short-term and arm's length. The industry relies heavily on competitive tendering, and often the lowest price wins, and it involves a multi-tiered subcontracting system as well. So work is subcontracted out to other companies to deliver certain components of the project. And within that whole environment, the arm's length nature of those commercial relationships makes achieving cultural alignment very difficult. And a number of scholars have written about this, and it applies to many different aspects of project performance, not least health and safety performance, which requires a high level of cultural alignment. Just to give you a sense of the complexity, and this is a complicated diagram, and I don't expect you'll be able to read it in its entirety, but it relates to a piece of work that we did recently on behalf of the Centre for Work Health and Safety of the New South Wales Government. And they asked us to do a qualitative investigation of looking at what are the factors that contribute to crane safety incidents in the construction industry. Now, obviously, when crane safety incidents occur, they can be very, very serious indeed. And so, you know, there's a real interest in how those incidents can be presented. And having done a lot of focus groups and interviews with construction companies, with crane operators, with clients, with regulators and other industry participants and stakeholders, this diagram shows all the factors that were actually identified as being potentially relevant to crane safety incidents. And you can see that those factors operate at different levels. So we have originating influences which relate to the commercial factors, to the regulatory factors, to factors around how well training and competency issues are managed, and the shortage of skilled workers in the industry, and other broader industry level phenomena. And then the next level down is shaping factors which occur at the construction project level, things like the extent to which crane operations are planned, and the extent to which people are under pressure to get the job done, the extent to which work hours are very long, and standardized processes and so on and so forth. Supervision comes in there as well. And then the immediate circumstances, which are the closest to the actual incident themselves, can be things related to workers' behaviours, not following manufacturer's instructions, maybe lapsing of concentration, materials, maybe using a crane that's too small for the task being performed, and then physical site factors like lighting and soil conditions and wind and weather and so forth. So this just gives you a sense of just how complicated the construction industry is, and how many different factors can actually contribute to incidents or to things going wrong. And in fact, what's even more interesting, I think, about this is that the interaction of factors at different levels can in fact have a cumulative effect and create conditions in which serious safety incidents can occur. So within this supply network complexity and this complex industry structure, we need to be mindful of a lot of things. To give you some policy context, the Australian Work Health and Safety Strategy in 2012 to 2022 identifies 2 priority action areas, both of which I want to touch on today because some of our research deals with both of these areas. The first one of those areas is actually a priority action area around improving work health and safety through supply chains and networks. So critically very important, relevant to what we're talking about today. And importantly, in that particular priority action area, they talk about the cumulative impact of different things that happen within complex supply networks that can actually create the conditions which give rise to safety and health issues. And commercial relationships, critically important. And it also talks about the need for industry leaders to champion work health and safety in supply networks. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of particularly a number of public sector clients organisations in the construction industry who are really driving a lot of activity around championing and leading change in the projects they procure. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the presentation. The other priority action area I want to highlight is that hazards should be eliminated or minimised by design. And this is the idea that we shouldn't wait for things to emerge on site and become apparent as problems. We should actually look upstream when we're making decisions about the design of structures, the design of plant, the design of substances, and the design of work and work processes and systems to actually eliminate hazards wherever possible or reduce them by design decisions so that they don't manifest as health and safety problems in the workplace. Now, I mentioned that there are some real leaders in public sector clients organisations in this work health and safety space. And just by way of definition, in construction, a client is the entity, individual or organisation that commissions and funds a project, either directly or indirectly. So if you like, they're the project sponsor, they're the people who are buying the services of the construction industry. And in 2009, there was a big review of the causes of construction fatalities in the UK undertaken by Rita Donaghy, and she concluded that public procurement is important because of its size and because of its potential for insisting on driving up standards, including health and safety. And importantly, when clients have a considerable volume of construction work that they're engaging in, they're actually in an even stronger position to initiate major improvements in the supply network than when they engage in single one-off projects, which is great because that shows what significant opportunities are currently available given the large construction programs of work currently underway in Australia. And we see organisations like the Victorian Government Major Transport Infrastructure Authority establishing a very strong vision to provide a safe workplace, prevent harm, care for everyone affected by their projects, and deliver transport infrastructure projects that achieve world-class construction safety performance. In New South Wales, Sydney Metro has developed a health and safety model which establishes principles of working and expectations of the delivery partners, being the construction companies they engage. And they've established a number of objectives to achieve between 2021 and 24, such as strengthening health and safety leadership capability, driving innovation to eliminate and reduce high-risk work, and to transform the measurement of health and safety to improve performance. So we're seeing, we are seeing this major shift, I think, in the way that client organisations are engaging with the supply network to really lead the way in driving improvements. However, very difficult and challenging context within which to do that, because the way the construction supply networks work can be very problematic. So pressures to win work mean that construction companies can sometimes accept risks that they haven't fully priced. They might commit to timelines which may in fact be challenging and unrealistic. The industry's described as having an optimism bias, whereby they assume everything will go right in projects when in fact things can go wrong that are outside the control of companies to manage, and that prevailing optimism bias can create pressures in project delivery. There are also often quite significant financial penalties for time overruns in projects, and that increases the pressure on construction companies once they win a job to actually deliver it on time, or be subjected to a fairly substantial financial penalty, and that can increase pressure, which then gets pushed in the form of long hours and demands and stresses down the supply networks, right down to subcontractors who really experience those things, but may not have the resources or the experience to manage the risks appropriately. And here's a nice quote from a construction company CEO who we interviewed recently in relation to a construction industry culture program that we're working with industry on. And he commented, "You've got a client who wants their projects delivered on time, but to win a job, you've got to win it on the right price and the right time. And sometimes we've got an optimism bias. You never say to yourself, oh, we're going to have these challenges, but in the delivery you do. It rains, designs aren't delivered on time. There's a number of different factors that contribute to being under pressure. And these pressures are systemic pressures that arise because of the way that construction projects have traditionally come together, and the way clients and contractors and others have engaged in a commercial sense. And they actually do have health and safety implications down the track. So moving on to the Construction Industry Culture Task Force work, which is an interesting piece of work that I'm involved with in collaboration with researchers from the University of New South Wales and the Australian National University, and also the University of Tasmania. And what the Construction Industry Culture Task Force is trying to do is it's trying to actually address the issue of long and inflexible hours of project-based work, trying to rethink working time practices in project-based work with a view to improving health and well-being, giving people time for life so they can actually participate in healthy and fulfilling lives outside of their work activity, and improving gender diversity within the industry. So the current issues, I've alluded to some of these already, I won't go through them again, but the future strategies are actually rethinking working time practices in project-based work. And there are a couple of trial projects currently running to evaluate the impact of changing from a 5-day week. Now, to many, a 5-day week might not seem radical, but in construction projects where work is traditionally a 6-day week, moving to a 5-day week is actually a big change. And so these 5-day week trial projects are running to determine what the impacts of those are on health, safety and well-being, and the impacts on workforce diversity and indeed productivity and performance. The opportunity to look at other alternative work time arrangements is also an important one, because there are many different models of working time, and it's important that we look at working time as a risk factor for poor health and poor safety in the construction industry. We've already talked a little bit about, I've already talked a little bit about the role that clients are playing, and this work was funded by the Office of the Federal Safety Commissioner, who asked us to identify what clients should do across the life cycle of a construction project to actually drive health and safety improvements. And so we tried to establish this based on the available research evidence, and specified what we thought clients should in fact do based on the best available evidence in the planning stage, in the design and procurement stage, in the construction stage, and in the completion stage of projects. So it took a life cycle approach, and this particular set of documents was adopted by industry and has been used in the delivery of major infrastructure construction projects here in Victoria. However, it was limited in the extent that what it did was it specified health and safety management actions that clients can take within their own organisations, but what it didn't do was adequately acknowledge that those management actions take place within the broader context of a commercial relationship and the commercial frameworks through which projects are delivered. Commercial frameworks can be loosely defined as the strategies and practices that the client uses to establish the commercial relationships that they enter into to achieve their ultimate goals and objectives in the construction project. It involves choosing a contracting strategy, establishing what the project objectives will be. They're often articulated as key result areas, and the way that performance is going to be measured against those objectives, and then the financial incentives and the mechanisms around financial incentivization that will be applied to the meeting of those objectives. So commercial frameworks are actually really important for health and safety, and we did a piece of work funded by the Major Transport Infrastructure Programme here in Victoria, looking at what commercial frameworks look like in case study projects in Australia, in the UK and in the US, and indeed, what were the characteristics of those commercial frameworks that were good for health and safety or maybe weren't working quite so well. And one particular client health and safety director, and this was actually from a UK case study, commented that if you have a commercial framework that's old-fashioned, if you've got people being bullied every time there's project performance meeting, if you're using a contract to wag the finger at the contractor, if you're wielding penalties rather than incentives, the whole approach to the contract drives contractors into a corner and squeezes performance out of them, then your health and safety will suffer and you won't get the best out of your contractors. So I think this was telling, because it was basically saying that some of the old-fashioned ways of doing business are in fact not working so well from a health and safety point of view, and that perhaps a more collaborative and less punitive approach may be warranted. So the research into commercial frameworks that I referred to that we undertook here relatively recently with the Major Transport Infrastructure Programme involved interviews with prominent client and contractor representatives here, but also in the UK and USA, and it established that health and safety requirements are often included in contracts between clients and their delivery partners, and that performance objectives for health and safety are usually established, including some minimum conditions of satisfaction. Historically, was a focus on safety, but now I'm really pleased to say that there's much greater emphasis being placed on occupational health, and there are some real leaders in that space, with clients leading the way to drive health improvements in the construction industry. Typically, performance is measured using a suite of leading and lagging indicators. That terminology is widely used in health and safety, but for those of you who may not be familiar with it, lagging indicators are things that have already gone wrong, rates of injury, rates of incidents that have occurred that have actually, you know, are negative things that have happened on projects, whereas leading indicators are usually more positive indicators of things that might be being done that may actually contribute to the prevention of incidents or ill health. So the term leading and lagging is an important one, and there's ongoing controversy, I guess, about how to balance those two sets of different types of indicators and their validity and reliability. Financial incentives are also often used, or indeed disincentives, in relation to health and safety. Moving back to the performance measurement considerations, one of the things that came out from that particular piece of work was that there was real concern, particularly from the contractor side, about the use of injury frequency rates as the measure of their performance. We were told that some clients put penalties into the contract, and it's generally about the injury frequency rate, so it's generally a lagging indicator. And if you have a lost time injury frequency, if you have a lost time injury on your project, you could lose 25% of your bonus, and companies become fantastic at hiding it. So I guess that the notion of hiding it becomes that, and people told us this, that people become very adept at managing the statistic, and it detracts from the management, the proactive management of health and safety. And so that was one of the messages that came out quite strongly. Another Alliance general manager told us that the industry's moved from just statistical measures to more positive means of conducting business, and it should be less about the focus of what we did wrong and more about what we could do right. Interestingly, there is a push towards the use of positive performance indicators and these leading indicators. However, actually making sure that the leading indicators you're using are valid and reliable is really critical. And interestingly, in this work, participants distinguish between the viewpoints of financiers of projects and the viewpoints of the delivery authorities who actually manage the operational delivery of the projects. Whereas the delivery authorities were seen to be very supportive of positive performance indicators and leading indicators and some of those less tangible things, the perception was that financiers were more focused on counting injuries and as a more what they perceive to be more objective measure of performance. So even just that little comment from the participants that there was a difference there between financiers and delivery authorities suggests that the clients' organisations themselves are not necessarily aligned in some of the things that they're thinking and doing, and that clients themselves must be regarded as complex and heterogeneous organisations in their own right. There may well be different groups, financiers, delivery authorities, end users, operators, and so on, who might have different perspectives on what good practice with regard to management of health and safety looks like. More comments on managing health and safety at the client-contractor interface. Another piece of work we did was looking at a longitudinal case study of a large infrastructure program where we actually followed the activities of this particular program for a period of about 12 months. And in this particular program, the client's organisation was introducing a lot of new measures that were designed to help the contractors to understand their health and safety obligations and actually respond to contractual requirements associated with lots of different aspects of the management of health and safety in their projects. And interestingly enough, what we observed initially was some boundary issues, some tension associated with managing health and safety across the client-contractor contractual boundary. There was some blurred responsibilities and some confusion about the extent to which clients should be specifying process requirements for health and safety, because one of the things that has traditionally been the case is that clients might specify a performance level that must be achieved, but not necessarily gone that step further and actually tried to offer advice or requirements around the processes by which that level of performance should be realised. So there was some tension there around the the process requirements and the sense of where was that blurring the responsibility between the role of the client and the role of the contractor. What was really important in that particular piece of work was that it became apparent that while the contractual requirements were really important and they set a really strong framework, scope and expectations for what delivery partners were expected to do in relation to health and safety, it was actually the relationships that delivered the outcomes. So what we saw was that between the clients and the contractors, there was a lot of interaction, a lot of informal and social interaction, and informal issue resolution, and it was through those relationships and those less formal mechanisms of control that the client was really able to effectively achieve what they wanted to achieve. So that was a lesson there, because contracts are useful and they're important, but supplementing them with good collaborative relationships is actually really important. And this was reflected by a client health and safety manager who commented that the majority of work I do and the outcomes I get are actually relationship based, because the contractual obligations really only give us so much. Now, moving on to the safety and design part of the agenda that's part of that underpins the Australian Work Health and Safety Strategy. A piece of work that we undertook it was funded by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the USA, and we undertook it in partnership with a research team at Virginia Tech in the US. Looked at how and when health and safety should be considered in construction projects. And we did quite a lot of work to answer that question, because it's quite a complex question. And we interviewed project stakeholders actually as design decisions were being made, and we actually sat in design team meetings in projects and observed the interactions between the stakeholders. And we collected a lot of data about when design decisions were made, by whom, how and why. And that data collection took place across 23 construction projects in Australia and the USA. And we undertook 288 quite detailed interviews in order to really understand those design processes in all their complexity. So the research examined the relationship between consideration of health and safety early in the project life cycle and the quality of health and safety risk control. So our dependent variable in this study was actually how well risks were controlled. And if you remember early on in the presentation, I said that the idea is that risks are eliminated or reduced so far as is possible by design decision making prior to actually work commencing. So the idea was, what we wanted to do was look at how many of those risks were actually identified, and actually how many of them were eliminated, or how many of them were designed out before construction work commenced. So that was the measure of the quality, and we developed a particular methodology based on the hierarchy of risk control, which categorizes risk controls according to their level of effectiveness. We used the hierarchy of control to actually really measure this, and that was our dependent variable against which we compared projects and their performance. And here's an example of some of the results that we found. So this is just one of the projects, and it's not even one of the projects, it's just one element of one of the projects that we looked at. And it shows you what's called a sociogram. It's based on social network analysis, where over the life of a period of decision making, we actually measured and quantified who was involved in decisions, how involved they were, and how important their involvement was. So the arrows in this diagram actually show the direction of information flows. The thickness of the arrows shows how prominent somebody's information exchanges were. And I guess what's important from a supply network complexity perspective is that you'll see in this diagram that we've got in the top right hand corner the architect and the client's engineer, and in the top left-hand corner, the constructor's engineer. And typically we think of design professionals as being architects and engineers, yet in fact, central to this decision-making network was in fact the operator. It was a rail project, and the rail operator themselves were really critical in terms of making decisions around design. And indeed the client was very influential, the rail authority and the constructor, and even the precast supplier, the supplier of precast concrete elements was influential. So it gives you a sense of design being much more complex than simply one actor who occupies a particular socio-technical role that's fairly abstract, like the designer. It's more complex than that. In fact, it involves many different participants whose interests and professional contributions all interact to shape decision making. And the other observation to make is that design work is really iterative. It involves thousands of information exchanges and feedback loops, and trade-offs are an inherent feature of decision making. So trade-offs are being made all the time. Design decisions are actually socially negotiated, and in that social negotiation, health and safety implications are formed. So the key findings in this particular piece of work were that better health and safety risk control outcomes, and by better I mean the ones that did result in eliminating or engineering out health and safety risks, were achieved when two things were present in these networks. Firstly, when construction contractors were involved early in the design process. So the early involvement of construction contractors was really important. And the second thing was when the construction contractors' involvement or centrality in the communication network was higher. So when they actually had some influence in decisions that were being made. Now, research into reducing musculoskeletal disorders in the rail construction work, I'd just like to talk a little bit about this particular piece of work, again undertaken with the support of the Victorian Government Major Transport Infrastructure Programme and WorkSafe Victoria. And what this work did was, in partnership with a team from RMIT School of Health and Biomedical Sciences, we used a whole body system of wearable sensors to actually measure what's going on in someone's body, what somebody's body goes through when they engage in a number of different construction activities. And you'll see here on the left that this particular activity was steel fixing. And steel fixing involves a worker pulling wire off a reel that's usually attached to their hip, bending the end to form a hook, shaping it around steel reinforcement bars that support concrete structures, and then using a hand tool or a pincer cutter to twist and cut the wire. So it's a very repetitive process. And in the US, some research shows that workers who do this job actually make between 400 and 600 of those movements each day. So you can imagine if you're doing that every day, particularly if you're working in a posture like this, to do that work, it takes a toll on your body. So we looked at the issues of tool selection and design, and we were able to use the wearable sensors to compare the performance of 3 different tools while doing steel fixing in a particular workplace environment. This was all done actually on site with live construction sites and real construction workers and real construction tasks. So it wasn't simulated at all. And we see that the man here, he's using conventional pincer cutters and the power tying tool at ground level. He's having to bend over, so his trunk flexion, his back's bent quite dramatically, and that's obviously not a good posture to sustain over a long period of time. The long handle stapler tool significantly reduced the extent to which he had to bend over. However, it still exceeded WorkSafe Victoria's guidance, which says that working with a trunk inclination greater than 20 degrees for more than 2 hours over a whole shift or continually for more than 30 minutes is a risk factor for musculoskeletal injury. So even that long handle stapler tool on the right hand side, though he's bending less, he's still bending in excess of what WorkSafe Victoria would suggest would be a safe extent. The conventional pincer cutter tool was particularly bad in terms of wrist movement because it involved a lot of wrist rotation and wrist flexion and extension in its use, whereas the power tying tool in the middle, which didn't require that twisting and flexion and extension, actually all had almost neutral wrist movement. So we concluded from this data, and I won't show you the data, but we concluded from this data set that the optimal solution for steel fixing at ground level would involve a long-handled tool, like the long-handled stapler, but with a power tying device attached to it. So rather than a stapler, a long-handled power tying tool. And interestingly enough, a manufacturer has actually made such a product and contacted me just last week to ask us if we could possibly look at that, and he could do a demonstration for us of that particular tool. The same piece of work involved looking at jackhammering, and we see here on the left-hand side a man who's engaged in breaking down the tops of concrete piles to expose the steel reinforcement bars to be able to construct the superstructure on top of those piles. Now, he's breaking that down using a jackhammer, which is held laterally, sort of horizontally, and it was taking, I believe, between 4 and 5 hours to break down one of these piles, and you can see there that there are several of them. He's exposed to noise, hand-arm vibration, dust, and musculoskeletal injury risk. And again, going back to looking at designing healthier, safer work processes, on the right-hand side, we see an alternative technology, which is based upon a chemical method, whereby a crack is chemically propagated within the pile at the desired level, desired height, and then the top pile cap can just be lifted off mechanically using a crane or some other lifting device. So we see that this on the right hand side, the alternative technology is safer, healthier, does produce better quality outcomes because there's less likelihood of damage of the steel, increased production efficiency, and it eliminates the need for jackhammering. Another piece of work that we did, which again it does involve talking about participation in process redesign, involved an ethnographic study of a participatory video intervention. Now, this work was really interesting because it involved construction workers being engaged through a facilitator in collaboratively scripting, acting, and filming their own work practices, and then using that process to evaluate their ways of working and possibly redesign ways of working. And this is an example of a scaffold erection process, a mobile tower scaffold, where you can see from the photo on the right that the man is actually erecting the scaffold, and in fact he's exposed to the risk of falling because there's no edge protection. So the participatory video facilitator commented there was just one phase, just for 30 seconds, where they were unprotected, and I said, I'm sure we can do something different. So the way they went about it was they got the workers to go back to the site, and they got them to rethink the way they erected the scaffold, and the solution they came up with was to use mid-platforms and horizontal members to provide edge protection, whereby people had edge protection throughout the entire erection process. And the site manager was impressed by this and said the previous way of building the scaffold had been custom and practice for decades. No one had thought twice about it, but once you saw it on the screen, it didn't look quite right. And we just got the guys who'd been doing it for years to try and find a way to fix it. And in the end, they did. And I guess the story here is that it was actually the visualization of the process. These people had been doing this job for a very long time, and the way of working had become second nature. But when they stood back and looked at the video of them doing it that they'd made themselves, it allowed workers and their managers to see things from a different perspective and better understand the dangers that they had previously not really recognized. And once those dangers had been identified, then solutions could be sought. Now, I can't really not talk about COVID, because in the past year we've experienced an extraordinary time with the COVID pandemic, and this has forced organisations to rethink the way they work, including construction organisations, and in some instances work has been radically transformed. And one area in which that work has been radically transformed is in the opportunity for some project-based construction workers to work from home, which would have probably been unheard of prior to COVID, but became an actual necessity due to physical and physical distancing requirements in order to keep work sites up and running during the pandemic. So what's been interesting here was it actually afforded us opportunistically to actually do some data collection to look at what was happening when workers were working from home. And we were given the opportunity to collect data for 8 weeks from project-based workers who were working alternate weeks, so 1 week in the office and 1 week at home. And we looked at their mental well-being, we looked at how they were experiencing work and what was going on during that time. Unsurprisingly, their mental well-being was in fact predicted by things that we know are related to mental well-being. So physical activity, satisfaction with work-life balance, sleep quality, and engagement in work. And we know those things are all good for health and mental well-being. However, we also observed that they were feeling pressured for time, work was interfering with social life, and some long work hours were negatively impacting their work-life balance. Again, not really particularly surprising there. But what did come out was that the context of COVID had actually increased the blurring of boundaries between work and non-work hours, and increased online communication, increased the irregularity of work hours, and this was particularly difficult for people with caring responsibilities. So I think what this tells us, now we had this wonderful opportunity to collect this data, is that there are real lessons for the future. And while working from home is very, very good for a lot of people find it actually helps them better balance work and non-work responsibilities. Organisations do need to be mindful of the potential harmful impacts of these blurring of boundaries, and therefore this will hopefully provide useful information to construction companies in the future as they think about work post-COVID, or think about flexible work options post-COVID. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with some of our thoughts about our future research agenda. So one of the things that we've become increasingly mindful of, and some of this has come out in the research that I've presented to you today, is that we're increasingly mindful that health and safety needs to be managed across many project interfaces in the construction industry. And while we've looked at the relationship between clients and contractors, and we've looked at the relationship between different design team contributors, we haven't looked at this holistically in terms of what goes on in a complex project environment. And so we know that we need to manage health and safety across inter-organisational boundaries and look at managing health and safety in this increasingly complex inter-organisational landscape. To date, most of the research that has been done in construction health and safety has really only focused on intra-organisational management systems, which has taken us a long way forward in terms of what we know and how we do things. However, we think that the next major step change in industry health and safety performance might actually be trying to look at these inter-organisational issues and the degree of collaboration, integration and alignment that takes place across project interfaces, and we're looking at the contractual relationships and the social interactions that take place, as well as the way that communication networks and information flows and influence shape decision making, which then ultimately impacts upon OH&S outcomes that are experienced by workers. So this involves looking at governance structures through which projects are delivered, as well as formal and informal social interactions, decisions, and ultimately health and safety outcomes. And we're sort of thinking that this is actually really an important next step for knowledge and understanding what really happens in complex construction project networks, and how that might impact on health and safety. And in order to achieve this, we want to use a multi-level network analysis technique, which would look at complex network relationships at that interface level, as well as the decision-making level, and look at the way that those two levels of these networks interact to produce health and safety outcomes. So for more information about our people, partnerships, projects and publications, you can find that on our website, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for a very interesting talk. So now it's sort of Q&A time. We have a few questions popped up. So one question is there an ability to access suggestions or templates for proactive commercial frameworks? Helen?
Well, not through our research, because we interviewed a lot of people and were given information from perceptions and insights from project participants, but we were not provided access to the detail of the commercial frameworks themselves for reasons of confidentiality in many cases. However, what we did do was we created a research to practice output, which included considerations and challenges to be thought about and dealt with in the design of a commercial framework. And that was broken into 3 different sections. It was broken into considerations around how you might measure performance, and considerations around how you might incentivize performance, and considerations around the hierarchical versus collaborative approaches that you might use to influence behavior across those boundaries through commercial frameworks. That's available on our website, and as is the full report. The full report's quite an extensive report, and it does contain a lot of examples of good practice. It contains case studies that talk about projects where things were done particularly well, and projects where lessons were learned, and it has a lot of detail in it. They're publicly available on our website, or if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to share them directly with you. But they're not templates, so to speak.
Is are the key client management action documents available online and practically required to be purchased?
Sorry, I missed that, Jing. You're dropping out. I'm afraid I can't.
You heard my question. So I think the next question is are the key client management action documents available online, or are they required to be purchased?
Oh, sorry. No, they're available online, and in fact, they're available on the Office of the Federal Safety Commissioner's website.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Xing, I can take over the question if you like.
Actually, from my personal interest.
Yeah, we have another question in the Q&A there, Helen, and that is there an ability to access suggestions or templates for proactive commercial frameworks?
I think I just answered that question. Did you hear my answer, or was there a technology problem?
Oh, we did. We had that one. We have another one here that says, are the key client management action documents? But we've had that one too. I think you've done well with the questions there, Helen. Xing had a question, but I'm not sure if his technical difficulties are resolved. Yes, I can see Xing's question now. How does Australia's benchmark OECD and how does Australia benchmark against the OECD and other countries?
I think Australia's performance is good relative to other countries. Certainly, compared to the UK, it might be comparable. Compared to the US, we're definitely a lot better. And in fact, it's interesting because I think sort of the US industry does in fact look to us as a model for doing particularly things like safety and design very effectively. So they often seek to learn from what's going on in Australia. I'm not quite sure, you know, I think there's while we compare favourably compared to other countries, I think it's probably fair to say that there's still a lot of opportunity to do things better. And I think particularly in the occupational health and the mental health and well-being areas, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So, you know, that's why I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done, notwithstanding the fact that we perform relatively well.
Thank you. And we've got another question that says, you spoke about some positives coming out of COVID in terms of alternative ways of working. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think what COVID's done is actually made people maybe rethink a lot of aspects of their lives and the way that we work and the way that we organise things. And it's actually shaken things up a little bit. So while a lot of the impacts were negative and a lot of people really did it tough and still are doing it tough, and it has been a terrible time for many. In fact, the construction industry is one of the industries that's actually maintained its operations throughout, and has done so very effectively through being able to demonstrate that health and safety could be managed effectively. So what this has effectively done is it's actually made health and safety a much more key strategic issue in these organisations, and it's an issue that's getting a lot of focus and a lot of attention, and rightly so, because in fact business continuity was absolutely critically dependent on health and safety being able to be managed and demonstrably managed effectively during the pandemic. But it's also made us think a bit differently about ways of working that might have seemed impossible before the pandemic. So the example I used about working from home or working flexibly, that is one of the significant barriers to, for example, women's participation in project-based roles, because the 6-day week and the requirement to be physically present for very long working days, and not having a lot of flexibility to do school pickups or drop-offs or things that a lot of people with caring responsibilities, not just women, people with caring responsibilities need to do, was really problematic for people in those project-based roles. So in fact, what's happened is in actually understanding that people can work from home and they can do so very productively. The interesting thing about the piece of work that I mentioned that I didn't refer to was the fact that productivity was maintained over that working from home. Meant that it showed us that you can give people that flexibility and still get projects delivered and still be effective in that delivery. What I think the opportunity to learn from arises from is that because the working from home was rushed, had to happen so quickly because of the COVID pandemic, there wasn't a lot of time to really think about how that might work and what it might look like and how it might be done to best protect workers' health and safety and well-being. So now we've got some data where we can look at that data and say, all right, we know working from home works for a lot of these people, but what are the things that we need to be mindful of in order to make sure that it works for them in a positive way and that we're managing the risks associated with it. So things like making sure people remain socially connected to their workplaces, even if they are working off-site, making sure people don't experience this blurring of the boundaries between work and family, make sure after hours contact, for example, is minimized or managed properly. So some of those things that were problematic in amongst the flexible working practices, we can actually learn from that and take that forward. I think that's a really good opportunity for the industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. I think our time is up. Thank you so much for an excellent talk and very enlightening. Certainly from, as an engineer, I actually learned a lot. So I'm pretty sure many others would have the same feeling. So thank you very much for the excellent talk, and thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully we will see you in our next distinguished. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jing. Thank you.